I said, I'm initially going to talk about why I think it works to have a relatively small state and most human activity, an overwhelming majority of it being in the private sector, and relatively low taxes, light touch regulation, and the rest of it. And I'm going to refer you to one book or piece of research which I think goes a long way to making that point and my case. And this is a piece of research that is produced by the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian think tank, Fraser. If you Google it, you'll find them. And if you Google Fraser Institute Economic Freedom of the World Index, you'll find out, you'll easily find the index that I'm referring to. Now, what the Fraser Institute do in their Freedom Index is they try to rank the freedom that exists in 162 economies across the world using 43 different indices of measurement. So what they're really trying to do is just to discover as objectively as you can, because there's, you're sometimes comparing apples with pears or oranges with bananas, but trying to work out of the 162 economies in the world, which are the most classical liberal and which are the least classically liberal. So they'll measure things like the size of government. In their view, the smaller the better, the bigger the worse. The legal system, does the rule of law exist, or do you tend to have to bribe officials or deal with organized crime? Property rights, is it obvious who owns what, or are there endless property disputes because there isn't a proper system of land registry, for example? Does the economy work on sound money, or is the government continually reprinting its banknotes with two noughts on the end of them, or can you trust the government's money supply? What's the freedom to trade internationally? Can you buy products in from other countries if you want to and sell to other countries if you want to? And what's the regulatory framework? Is the government incredibly prescriptive about exactly how you need to run your business, exactly what you've got to pay your employees, exactly what health and safety measures you need to take on the stairs or the production line, or is it relatively light touch? Those are some indications of the metrics they use. And the idea behind this report is to find out, really, whether adopting across those 43 indices pro-freedom approaches and policies it brings with it successful outcomes. So what we can do is to compare, basically, the most classical liberal, the most capitalist, you might say, economies, and to compare that information to see if those economies have better outcomes for their citizens compared to what you might call more socialist, more interventionist economies with a much bigger state and less role for the individual. So to try and enable that analysis to take place, to see if there is a correlation between economic freedom, classical liberalism, and human well-being, this index, the Economic Freedom of the World Index, splits the 162 economies into quartiles, into four groups, based on their level of economic freedom. A bit like, I guess, our four football divisions in England. There's a Premier League going all the way down to the League Two, or the fourth division, as it used to be said, and they'll put the Fraser Institute will put the most classical liberal societies in the Premier League and the least liberal and free societies in League Two. And then we can compare these different groups. Are the more socialist economies doing well, or the more liberal, classical liberal free market economies doing well? And the results, in my view, are so staggering that even if you have complaints about the exact methodology, the evidence is overwhelming and the jury is in. If you want the people in your society to be healthy, wealthy, wise, happy, insofar as that can be measured, then classical liberalism, free market capitalism is unambiguously the way forward and the tools that you should adopt. So let me give you some of those statistics without just, I don't want to machine gun you with endless numbers, but let me talk through some of them. So I've made a lot of assertions here, but I haven't given you any proof. Let's look at average incomes. Income's not the only thing that matters to people, but I guess it matters quite a lot. It's something that we discuss a lot. We get worried if incomes in Britain are going down, which clearly they are at the moment in the lockdown. But let's look at the average income in that top quartile of countries, and by top I mean the most classically liberal, and compare it to the 25% of countries that are the least free. They have the highest taxes, the biggest state, the highest regulation, the worst rule of law, and the rest of it. And what you find is in the freer countries, the most classically liberal ones, average incomes are 6 times higher. So in those top 25% countries from a classical liberal perspective, the average income is a little bit higher than $36,000 US. And in the worst 25%, that bottom division, the average income is just a little above $6,000 US. So there's a remarkable, stunning correlation, at least, between being classical liberal, broadly capitalist and free market, and having high average incomes. But what's interesting as well, because I can anticipate a question will be, it might be the rich benefit, but what about the poor? If you're averaging it out, that might just be because there's lots of billionaires and millionaires, but are people at the bottom of a capitalist, free market, classical liberal society suffering far more than they would in a socialist society? No, the gap here is even more staggering. So if you look at the bottom 10% of income earners in different countries, the lowest 10%, and you look at the lowest 10% in capitalist countries, classical liberal countries, and the lowest 10% in the least classically liberal countries, then actually the difference is 7 times higher income in the richer countries. So if you're going to be in the bottom 10% of the country that you live in, you still definitely want to be living in a relatively free market, liberal, capitalist country, not in a socialist one, even more so than the average earner. If you're an average earner, you appear to be 6 times better off, earning 6 times as much money as in the more socialist societies. But if you're in that bottom 10%, you're 7 times better off than you would be if you were in the bottom 10% of a poorer society. Similarly, if you were looking at not just the bottom 10%, but extreme, absolute, abject poverty, I think this is defined by the World Bank of trying to get by on a salary of or income of less than $1.90 a day. That's reckoned to be about the point that you're probably below subsistence, nearly one hell of a challenge to stay alive. So how many people are struggling on those appalling income levels? Well, again, if you look at the fourth division, the least classically liberal countries, about 27% of people in those countries are living in that extreme poverty, in utter destitution, more than a quarter struggling to even live. And if you look at the most classically liberal economies, those with relatively lower taxes, less regulation, and less of a role for a state, there is still abject poverty, but it's a bit less than 2% of the population who live in the freer countries. So what we see pretty clearly, if you like, almost whichever group you wish to compare with whichever group, whether you want to compare the average citizen in free market countries to the average citizen in socialist countries, whether you want to compare the bottom 10% of the citizenry with the bottom 10% of the citizenry, or whether you actually want to look at how good is each society at making sure that people aren't living in absolute devastating poverty, then there is no doubt you want to be in that classical liberal free market capitalist league of clubs. You want to be low tax, low regulation, low government spending, good quality rule of law, and the rest. But it's not just about economics. You'll probably be unsurprised to know that the other metrics that we might care about are produce better results in classical liberal countries than in their socialist counterparts. So if you want to live longer, you want to be in that top quartile of the most free market countries in the world. You will, on average, live 14 years longer than someone who is in the least classical liberal quartile, that fourth division of countries. Other metrics you might want to look at are, say, infant mortality. That top quartile of countries, the most classical liberal, their infant mortality rate is 6 times lower than the bottom 25%, the most socialist countries. And you can look at a whole range of other measures as well, if you like, non-economic factors that you might consider have real value, and you'll find that the most classical liberal countries have far greater political and civil liberties, greater gender equality, and the extent to which you think you can measure things, and this is a hazy area, seem to indicate that they're happier countries as well. So it seems to me that the case is pretty overwhelmingly strong, that if you want those things, longer life, less people dying in child death, higher incomes, not just for the affluent, but for the average, the poor, and a lack of destitution, the evidence is in, according to the Fraser Institute. You want to be one of the classical liberal countries.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.